So the first thing when parents come to me, whether it's my age, I have young kids myself. So a lot of South Asian clients that I have are trying to break generational traumas. And I don't know about how you grew up, but my parents did not play with us. You know, playing was for the kids.
God,
you
no.
played with your siblings, you played with your cousins, and you just like listened to what your parents told you to do, right? How do South Asian parents show love? By food, cooking for you, right? Many people can remember memories of their mom cooking for them or their dad home cooked meals, making you your favorite things and providing for you. Life's about friends, and like you could be the coolest mom ever and he's still gonna want to talk to his friends, and that's okay, right? I told my child, like, don't worry, like just do the best you can, but the child has already internalized that they need to be the best at everything.
Hello and welcome to season 2 of What's Brown Got to Do with It. So today I'm going to kick off this season with my very first guest, Dr. Nadia Huq, who is a child psychologist, earned her bachelor's in brain, behavior and cognitive science, followed by a master's and PhD in clinical psychology. Dr. Nadia completed her pre-doctoral internship at the Children's National Health Systems and a postdoctoral fellowship in clinical child psychology. Dr. Nadia also served as a clinical psychologist and faculty member at Columbia University Irving Medical Center for 6 years, specializing in therapy for children and families and training psychology interns. I know that was a kind of a long introduction, but I really wanted to really put out there what your credentials are because of the conversations that we're going to go into. So, Dr. Nadia, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. I love to talk about mental health, so this is my jam.
Yeah, and I love to talk about South Asian, so bringing them together it's actually a great recipe for this podcast. And today we are going to be focusing on kind of South Asians and a bit about generational traumas inflicted on South Asians, as well as on how to deal with talking about mental health to our children and parents. So we have a lot to get through, but where I do want to start, and you and I briefly spoke about this last week, but I would love for you to share with the listeners a little bit about your thesis, the basis and the findings of what you actually did your thesis on.
Oh, wow. Yes. Happy. It feels like light years away, but yeah. So one of the things that I focused on when I was in graduate school and inspired a lot by my own upbringing, right? I'm first generation American. We kind of spoke about that. My parents immigrated from Bangladesh to Florida. And so a lot of what I did in my graduate school research was reflective of my own kind of personal experiences and thoughts and questions that came up. So when I was in my graduate program, I studied acculturation conflict. So for those who may not know, essentially that's the term for what many of us South Asians have felt and maybe didn't have a word for when we were growing up. But this difference of our immigrant parents and us being US born or wherever UK born, and that challenge that caused, right? Some of that conflict where, for instance, growing up where sometimes my mom would get mad at me and say, oh, you're just too American. And I'd be like, but I am American. I was born here. So, that kind of conflict, or if your parents made you feel like you weren't brown enough, right? South Asian enough. So that kind of conflict. So I studied that in graduate school. I studied that in a Latino population. That was my advisor worked with Latino population. And so I studied acculturation conflict, and I did find that the more conflict you have with your parents with these cultural clashes, right, the more likely a youth is to have depression, lower self-esteem. So there are these repercussions of that kind of conflict. And one of the most interesting things that I found also was that the more conflict that whatever US born, they're US born, what I studied, but had with their immigrant parents, the less likely they were to feel proud of their ethnicity, right? So the less likely they were to feel connected and proud of their,
Mm.
parents' background. And that led to lower self-esteem. So kind of the takeaway message for me in that research would then influence the clinical work I do now. I predominantly do clinical work now, but it really influenced the way I approach a lot of families is those family connections are so important, and minimizing that conflict or finding ways to talk about it, because it genuinely is just better for a child to develop, more confidence about who they are, feeling a
Mm.
connection to that ethnicity. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's hundreds of pages of dissertation in a
Oh,
nutshell, but
I mean, that's so
that's
interesting though, because yeah, that's how we know it as we would know it now. But for, which brings me actually to my next question, and it is around generational trauma. Um, we often come from a cultural framework that, often does emphasize family loyalty and
mhm,
silence in so many, like in
mhm.
various forms. So how, in your opinion, does generational trauma manifest in South Asian families? And how would you know, what are the key challenges in that? And how would you address that? Because from a child perspective, that's, you know, we're the ones that have to carry that trauma, and then it
Right,
goes around in a circle.
right. Generational trauma, it's tough. It's really hard. I think the first thing when I talk about it with families, even in my clinical work, is to kind of acknowledge that, yes, what our parents went through, our grandparents went through, right? Many of our parents and grandparents went through various wars and conflict and really had to be in survival mode a lot of the time. And what
Mm.
we know now, there's a lot more just like up and coming research about generational trauma and how it doesn't change your DNA. For instance, if your grandparents went through famine or something really stressful, but it can influence the expression of certain genes, right? So there is this like level, I'm not a geneticist or a biologist, but there is this level of that can link from generation to generation. So the first thing when parents come to me, whether it's my age, I have young kids myself. So a lot of South Asian clients that I have are trying to break generational traumas. And one of the first things I
Mm.
say about that is healing yourself, right? And I think that's one of the ways to think about how you want to raise your children, and then your children will raise their children. So, like, really thinking about how you can heal from whatever you had experienced. But I think in terms of the generation before us, I encourage, first of all, we can't control other people. That's the first thing. We cannot change people. Uh, but storytelling and having people talk about what they went through, and having, even our parents talk about how they were parented and what their grandparents were like. I think there's a lot of value in just being able to sit and hear that, and for people to be able to talk about it. So talking about it, openness, but the onus really lots of times is on us to do what we can for our individual selves as parents, and breaking some of those habits that maybe we
Mm.
were raised with. Um, but focusing too much on changing the folks before us it's tricky. You can, but I
Mm.
think
Mm.
you know what I mean. So that framework of really,
Yeah, of
what can
course.
I do uh,
Mm.
to,
But in
you
that
know,
Yeah. In that sense, I mean, I'm aware of my or our generational kind of privilege
yes,
to talk about mental health.
yes.
And our parents are kind of a byproduct of their own upbringing.
Mm-hmm.
So, then there becomes I mean, we're going to move on to like some culture clashes.
Right.
How do you deal with like South Asian families who have cultural clashes between, I don't know, traditional values and modern perspectives, which
Right.
impact, and how does that kind of impact mental health and family dynamics? Because that must be quite a huge aspect of it.
Right. That is huge. And I also really appreciate you acknowledging our privilege to talk about this, because for many of us who have immigrant parents that were just thinking about getting food on the table or making money, trying to learn a new language, like, who has time to talk about mental health when you're really trying to do the basics, right? So it is a privilege, and it is something that I hope continues to be a conversation. What I will say about culture clashes and families, we do know that they can be harmful, right, for family relationships. A couple of things when I work with families, I like to think about is how old are the people that are involved, right? So I work with teenagers, I work with young adults, I work with parents. That's mainly kind of my expertise. And first acknowledging when I work with my young kiddos that, you are a kid and you got to listen to your parents, right? But it's a little bit of a different conversation that I'll have with someone in their 20s who's struggling with their family dynamics, right? So, I don't take necessarily like this broad perspective. It really does depend on the age of the child and the kind of interactions there. One of the first things I like to do, which is why I try to take a family approach, is because I do think it's important. We work in the context of our family, especially with the younger kids that I work with. Kids are not just an individual in this world, and neither are we as adults. My mom still calls me every day, and I'm almost 40, right? So, we work in this function, we work in this like family unit. And I think that's one of the best values of our South Asian culture, this like family importance and this, just value. It's a beautiful thing that is good for mental health when appropriate. So what I come back to is, number one, trying to just focus on having healthy relationships first with the younger kids and their parents, right? Like encouraging parents to play with their kids, which is very different from, I don't know about how you grew up, but my parents did not play with us. Playing was for the kids. Oh, God, you played with your siblings, you played with your cousins, and you just like listened to what your parents told you to do, right? So one of the things that I try to encourage parents is to have good relationships with their children. And what I mean by that is like warmth, but having boundaries, right? So there's this like kind of beautiful mix of warmth, but appropriate boundaries, right? And I think when you have a good or can work towards a good relationship with a parent-child, then there's so much more opportunity to have those conversations. It's easier to have conversations. So I think a lot of this generational, our parents even had more formal relationships with their parents, probably, right? And being able to change that a little bit and encourage parents to have these warm relationships is a big part of what I do. And then we can have these tough conversations.
But how would that translate into kind of into real life? For example, if someone has grown up in quite a in a household where everyone has a different love language as well, right? And you've grown up, you're a byproduct of an environment whereby you don't really see love. It's very transactional. And then how do you then translate that into, what do you, warmth is relative. So how would you be warm? And, if someone out there is listening, me,
yes,
one of my struggles is with my son is, I'm always thinking, and I'm always saying to my friends that, he doesn't talk to me and he doesn't tell me things, and I'm not my parent. I have parented in the complete opposite way. I took everything I didn't like about my parents' parenting and changed that, and I kept all the things that I thought were great. So why does he still not talk to me?
It's a great question.
Please help.
So two-part question. I actually love what you mentioned about for South Asian families or other whomever. Again, there's a lot of nuances in the communities. There's a lot of intersection of identities, religion,
Yeah.
socioeconomic status, right? So I'm
Yeah.
talking broadly about South Asians, but there's so much different. There's a lot of intersectionality
Yeah.
that
Of
happens. But
course. Yeah.
one of the first conversations I have with either young adults that come to me who are kind of processing their own past or kids is how different cultures show love in a different way. And with a lot of the South Asian families I work for, I talk about the themes. How do South Asian parents show love? By food, cooking for you, right? Many people can remember memories of their mom cooking for them or their dad home cooked meals, making you your favorite things and providing for you, right? So I think many of us, for me who grew up in America, the white family down the street, I love you and hugs. And we did not do all of that. There were no hugs, there were no I love yous. But my dad always made sure that we had money for what we needed, right? My mom always made sure that we had healthy foods and cooked for us. So I think a part of it is just realizing like that is how our culture shows love, right? And, the I love yous and the hugs, like they don't express it that way. But when you come home from college, does your mom have your favorite meal on the table? Most brown folks will say, yeah, right. How does your dad show money? And I'm being gendered here because that's just my upbringing. And I don't mean to put gendered, thing out there. But my dad, the way he didn't say I love you, but he would be like, do you need money? Do you need money for something? My mom didn't say I love you, but she would say I remember I went to the University of Michigan, and when I would come home, what do you want to eat when you come home? It was never I miss you. It was never I love you. But what do you want to eat while you're here? Right. So I think
that's so interesting because for me growing up, like my parents the same, it was never a I love you. But me raising my son, I made a conscious effort that I will tell him I love him every second of the day. And I was very much like, I never want him to turn back and think, oh, my mum never told me that she loves me. And so now it's just become such second nature. Like every conversation, I love you too.
Yeah.
Or, I'm going to bed, I love you. Like it's overkill. But at least,
I think it's great. I tell my kids I love them all the time.
I don't put food on the table.
So
I don't cook your favorite meals.
But that's how you show your love. I do it with my kids too. So I very much, I love you and hugs and you're so beautiful. Like, and I think we all kind of take a little bit about what we didn't have. And I think that's all great. And I think just this acknowledgement that there's not really a right or wrong in how you show love per se. But I think to acknowledge that different people need different things, right? So, a child, maybe we felt we needed the I love yous. And I think reflecting back, that would have been nice. But now as an adult who's done my own healing, and I love my parents, they were great. I had a great childhood. Being able to just acknowledge like, that's how they showed me they loved me in itself is healing enough. Now to get to your son. So how old is your son?
He's going to be 16.
So 16-year-old son. So to answer your question, it is totally developmentally appropriate for a 16-year-old to not want to talk to his mom about everything, right? So I think that a little bit of acceptance on your end that is what 16-year-olds do, that are what, that is just a part of appropriate development, that during your teen years, your adolescence, like you turn to your friends a little bit more, you tell your friends more things. I encourage parents to definitely not necessarily force conversations, but to be there. And it sounds like you do that, for him to know that you love him, that you'll be there for him, and that you're there for him if he wants to talk. And sitting back a little bit.
What's funny is once I asked him, because I often worry, like, I don't know what's going on in his head. So one day I actually asked him, I said, if you were in trouble, would you think my mum's going to kill me or my mum's going to save me? And without hesitating, he said, mum's going to save me. So I was like, okay, saving grace in this is, as long as you know that I'll always be there, it's fine. Don't talk to me.
Perfect. And I think that's really reflective. And I'm so glad you asked him that, because I think many of us growing up would have been like, mom's going to kill me or dad's going to kill me. I definitely had
Still,
that.
still,
Yeah. So
I
I
still
know.
do it.
But I think the fact that your son, so you've done it, you've done the work. Relationships are forever growing and changing. And 16 is life's about friends. And like, you could be the coolest mom ever, and he's still going to want to talk to his friends. And that's okay. Right. It does
Mhm.
things. 20s, your relationship will change a little bit in your 20s, and it changes in your 30s, right? There's this like beautiful, just natural, you become more friendship like or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
But if he said he's going to call you if he's in trouble, you're good. I would sleep easy.
Yeah. So when we talk about like some of the generational differences, um, what, in your opinion, are some of the kind of common mental health challenges that arise due to the generational differences, especially kind of between the first generation South Asian immigrants and their children? And how do you go about bridging that gap?
I love that question. So I would say one of the common things, at least in my research and what I've seen out there, and the good news is there's so much more research coming out, even in, uh, I graduated, can't remember when I graduated, 2016 or 2015, but so much more has come out. One of the main things I used to see in my research, and I do see in my clinical work as well, more of that
Mhm.
parent-child acculturation conflict, more depressive symptoms, right? The sadness,
Hmm.
uh, and lower self-esteem, right? So there's just, that depression
Hmm.
uh, and the self-esteem, just kind of feeling like, you're not American enough and you're not brown enough, and the identity conflict. So there was a lot of that, like identity struggles and self-esteem, confidence, depression. That's what I would see a lot. And there are now, there are actually, one of my practice, we're going to launch a group that is for this, like immigrant parents and US born children, youth, to talk about conflicts, right? So our vision is we'll probably start with just a parenting group to work with parents, but the ideal goal is for there to be parents and their youth in the group, and we'll do a little bit of together and then break off and then together and break off to talk about values differences, to talk about communication.
Hmm.
So there is a lot of good work that's coming out to address these things. A lot of it comes back to communication, putting it out there. What are your values? Where do you clash? Where can we
Hmm.
compromise? Uh, what mom and dad are you willing to let go of a little bit? And then to the youth, like,
Hmm.
where are you willing to meet your parents? And so, and a lot of just like education about expectations and parents. It's unrealistic to expect your child to be as brown as you are. I'm using that term generally, right?
Hmm.
Like, it's just not realistic. And it's also not realistic for youth to expect that their parents are just going to be okay with them totally letting go
Hmm.
of their roots. So, where can we meet, and where can we agree
Hmm.
that these are the things we're holding on to?
Hmm.
These are things I'm going to have to let go. Uh, so, I think that's kind of a
Yeah. It's
synopsis.
important, but that kind of brings me to my next question, which is how is, and again, we're generalizing, and just for
Yes.
anyone listening, when we're talking about South Asians, we are generalizing. We're very broad. We understand, like as Dr. Nadia said at the beginning, like different cultures have different nuances. So we are acknowledging that. But in general, how do you think mental health is kind of acknowledged or ignored um, within South Asian communities? And what are kind of like some of the, I know we've come a long way from
Mhm,
maybe from my parents' generation, where there was such a huge stigma
mhm,
and discouragement to have kind of open conversations about mental health, or even having terminology.
mhm,
For example, I used to often hear people like older generations say like, oh, in Urdu, they said, "Mera dil ghabra raha hai," which means, my heart is kind of pounding or
Racing. Yeah.
racing. Fast forward, like, a few decades, you realize that that was probably signs of anxiety.
Right.
Um, so how do you kind of combat that now? And how are we talking, having more conversations to reduce the stigma, and having more open conversations about mental health within South Asian communities?
Right. So, yes, I think the stigma's still there. I agree with you. There's been a lot of progress in the last couple of decades, and we still have a long way to go. What I usually recommend, or my approach when I talk with a lot of families, is I try to remove the labels from it at all and take a bit of
Mhm.
like just a storytelling perspective. That's what I did with my parents. Like, tell me a little bit about your family and what was, Nana like or Nanu like when they were growing up. And then you'll find as you
Mm.
talk about family relationships, exactly what you said, these words. Oh, I remember my mom said something like, oh, my dad's side of the family, so my grandfather, she's like, they're all just like really
Mm.
nervous people. It's like, yeah, okay, they're really nervous. So like anxiety. She's like, no, not anxiety, just nervous.
Mm.
They're just really nervous. And that's okay. We'll leave it at that. And then people would talk about things in a health way that'd be like, oh, they're describing a panic attack, or yeah, heart racing, couldn't breathe.
Mm.
Or, I remember my father talking about one of his aunts. Yeah, she would just stay inside for kind of months at a time and we wouldn't really see her. And then she would be fine again. And then she would kind of just be in her house again. I'm like, huh, in my head, I'm thinking depression, right? And so first letting people talk about these stories and then saying, that sounds like that could have been depression. That sounds like that may have been
Mm.
anxiety. It sounds like that could have been ADHD, right? When my parents would
Mm.
talk about the kids in their class that would always get in trouble and could never stay in their seats and they were just labeled as the bad kid. I'm like, that's probably ADHD and that people didn't know what it
Mm.
was. And so I think being able to use the way people describe it and then slowly kind of put a conceptualization to it or a label to it to help people understand that, yeah, these things have been around for a long time. And
Mm.
and then kind of taking it from there. Like, okay, so what would have helped if there was something I commonly do, if there was something that would have helped your aunt or your uncle or your friend who was having a hard time in class, like, would you have wanted them to get that help? Right? Would you have wanted them to be able to da 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 da? And most people will say yes. And so then I bring it back. So
Mhm.
that's what mental health treatment or behavioral health treatment is about. It's about helping people focus if they have a hard time focusing. It's about helping people feel happier if they're feeling sad a lot. It's about helping people learn how to, you know, relax their body if their heart is racing and they're feeling nervous.
Mm.
So, kind of moving labels aside as much and just like bringing it back to what it actually is, I think helps move the conversation forward.
How much of it is pressure? I just feel as a South Asian, there's
Mm-hmm.
just so much more, from a child to an adult. I see it like, with kids nowadays still like this pressure of having to always, still achieve. I mean,
Yeah.
back in my day, you were either a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer, or something like
Right.
that. I think that that's changed now a
Mm-hmm.
lot. I think us as parents in this generation, we're more likely to, again, I'm generalizing, but encourage our children to follow their dreams, their passions.
Mm-hmm.
But I
Mm-hmm.
feel like there's still this sense of, but you still need to achieve.
Right.
And I don't know how much of that comes from, the culture and that I was also raised, or, friends
Right.
or people that I see. And how do we kind of break away from that?
Yes, I don't know that that pressure's going away anytime soon, to be honest. I think
Mm.
that's there. And I think that there is like an intergenerational kind of part of that because I actually now see some South Asian families where the parents are like, I told my, child, like, don't worry, like, just do the best you can. But the child has already internalized that they need to be the best at everything. And it's like
Yeah.
parents now are telling me, like, it's okay if they don't get straight, A's, like, in America, we A's and B's and stuff. But the
Mm.
child is like, no, my parents like will be upset if I don't do well. And the parents like, I'm not going to be upset. And the child's like, yes, you will. And they're like, I really won't. So there is a lot that's happening. I do think there's a lot of pressure for the younger generation growing up now to, I think they see it. A lot of the parents are successful because we were a result of our parents and what they did. And so there's
Mm.
this balance. They're kind of battling, well, I want to be successful and I want to do what I love. So what I say to that is, I think that we live in this world where we do have to make money to survive. So there is a reality to it, right? And just as much as
Mm.
possible, finding that balance of, yes, we want you to do something you love. We also want you to take care, be able to afford housing and food, and just acknowledging that let's find a way where both can be true. So, because it is the reality of life that you need to make money. Like there's no getting around
Mm.
that.
Mm.
So I think what I tell families a lot is a little bit of anxiety is healthy, right? Like if we all walked
Mm.
around this world not worried about anything, we'd might get hit by a car, or we may realize, oh, I
Mm.
don't have money in my bank account to buy food, right? So a little bit of that anxiety is important to keep you in line.
Mm.
When your anxiety starts to interfere with your functioning, when it's so much that it's actually getting in the way of you being productive, that's when it's unhealthy. But if there's a little bit enough like,
Mm.
oh, I really got to pass this test and I really have to study, or I really have to apply for college, university, a little bit is good.
Yeah. How much, sorry, I know we're running out of time, but very
Yeah, no, please.
quickly,
Yeah.
how much emphasis or importance, how important do you think it is to have like preventative um, kind of therapy or sessions, or just how it should be embedded? Again, when we're talking about the stigma, um, but when we go for example, we'll go for body checkups, health checkups. How important is it to have mental mind checkups for, children, even from a young age?
I think it's crucial. In an ideal world, there would be really good preventative care or screening so that things don't, you know, turn into something bigger and bigger and bigger, right? So that's part of the reasons my passion of working with children and families. I work with a lot of parents with young kids, is let's try to do what we can as early as possible to set kids on a good
Mm.
trajectory. In an ideal world, and I'm seeing it more in the US, pediatricians would do screeners at every appointment, right? If there are any mental health
Mm.
concerns, they would get linked in right away to some preventative care, right? What we know is majority of mental illnesses actually they start when you're kids, right? I think it's like 50% by the time you're
Mm.
14 and another like 75% by the time you're 24. I don't quote me on those
Oh,
exact numbers,
wow.
but it's like they
Mm.
start young. And so the more we can do to bring awareness and have people get care when they're young, it's like better for society as a whole. And so we're not having adults in their 30s now unpacking years and years of not getting the help that they needed.
Mm.
So I'm all about preventative care. In an ideal world, I think that would just be how we approached it. And we're not there yet, but I think we're moving there slowly.
Amazing. Yeah. I think there's still a lot to be done, but it's
Hmm.
great that we're able to even have these kind of conversations,
Yeah.
and acknowledge. And it makes me really happy that, you have clients,
Yeah.
patients that are coming to you as families, and, even parents are kind of acknowledging that they need the help. So
Right.
it's a good step in the right direction.
Yes.
One thing I do like to end the show with is asking all my guests.
Uh-huh.
That is, what's brown got to do with it for you? So what does it mean to, I don't know, kind of be brown in your field, in your expertise? How does it shape you, influence you?
Mm. Oh wow, that's a big question. It's what does brown got to do with it? So for me, what's interesting is when I was growing up, I was very much I viewed myself as there's this brown side of me and then there's this American side of me, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was very like, I hang with my brown friends and we do this, and I hang with my white friends and we do this. And
Mm-hmm.
now I think in the last, after being an adult, I genuinely feel that it's very like integrated, right? And so I think like, I don't think of things as the brown side and the American side. It's just all
Mm-hmm.
together. I think for me, being brown, the first thing, it's just like identity and values. I think family values is a big thing for me. And being brown always often comes back to family and relationships. And I think that's what led me to my work. That's why I mainly do family work, because I genuinely want
Mm-hmm.
families to be happy. I want kids to get along with their parents. I think that that is so crucial to having
Mm-hmm.
good well-being. So yeah, I think being brown is like, I guess family, if I were even to put it like family. I don't know. But
I get that. And I
yeah.
understand that. But Dr. Nadia, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Just lastly, do you do online consultations too? And if so, how does one get in touch with you if they wanted to, either online or in person?
Yes, I do. I'm actually predominantly doing telehealth now because I work with a lot of parents and young kids, so that works better. I do. So I'm a part of a private practice in the US. I'm licensed in New York, New Jersey, but I also have the certification where I can actually do telehealth with people in majority of the United States. It's this kind of legislation that came out. They could go on our website and find, me, and I can kind of give you that information. I'm happy to give you my phone number, my business line. People could call me, they could email me. So we can maybe include that, or I
Okay,
could say it
perfect.
now.
Well, I'll
Yeah.
add it.
Yeah.
I'll add it to the link in the bio. But thank
Sure.
you, Dr. Nadia, so much. This was really interesting. I love that I started off this season talking about this
Yeah.
because this is something that I can talk about forever. So thank you. I really appreciate you joining me today. And for anyone listening, if you do want to get in touch with Dr. Nadia, then the link is in the description. Please feel free to reach out to her directly. Thank
Thank you
you,
so
and
much.
hopefully we'll speak again. I'm sure there's so
Yes.
much more we can talk about, but
I know. Thank you so
we'll
much
be
for
done
having
soon.
me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.